What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of the UK's covert biological testing on its own population during the Cold War. I used to call it data, metrics, drift behavior, particle distribution. We had names for everything, except the people. We didn't refer to them as citizens or families or children. We called them unexposed controls, until they weren't. They told us we were measuring ventilation, testing environmental resilience. But I remember the sound of the canisters locking open. I remember the fog blooming behind rooftops. I remember the silence that followed. What we released wasn't lethal, not immediately, not measurably, but it was real. It settled into their lungs, their curtains, their lives they never knew. That was the point. I'm not asking for forgiveness, only that someone else remembers, because I still see it, even now. And I know that fog was never meant to leave. They said it was harmless, zinc, cadmium, sulfide, light dispersible, perfect for drift studies. A simulation agent, nothing more. It shimmered faintly under ultraviolet light and clung to surfaces like memory. It wasn't designed to hurt anyone, at least not in the way weapons usually do. I was assigned to the coastal operations first. Small towns, early mornings. We'd arrive before sunrise under the pretense of environmental testing. Equipment loaded into unmarked vans, spray canisters modified to fit beneath exhaust vents. We were told the coastal winds made for ideal distribution. The sea would carry it far inland. We called it the early drift program. But I remember something else, the way it looked at dawn. By midday it vanished, transparent, undetectable, but just before the sun broke the horizon there'd be a moment, a glint of something in the air, a shimmer you could almost feel. It looked like fog, curling low across fields and gardens, slipping beneath hedges and under porch rails. But it wasn't fog, it was listening. That's what I called it in my notes. The fog that listens. Because I swear when I stood beside the van, watching the first plumes roll out across the neighborhood, I could hear something in the silence. Not wind, not wildlife, just this waiting. We tested across dozens of towns. Names that still sit like gravel in my teeth. Salisbury, Cardington, Norwich, the kind of places where people leave their doors unlocked, where children ride bicycles past strangers and offer a polite morning. They waved at me, mothers walking strollers, grandfathers reading the paper on porches, a group of boys playing near a school gate. The fog drifted past all of them, invisible in the daylight, trailing behind their laughter like smoke no one noticed, and I smiled back. It wasn't malicious, not then. I believed what they told us, that it was safe, that it was for national security, that war wouldn't wait for permission. We were data gatherers. That's what they called us, engineers of prevention. Still, I began watching them too closely. I noted which houses opened windows early, which schools had faulty seals, which streets pooled air near the ground longer. I kept unofficial charts. I mapped human routines with a kind of religious detail. Where they breathed, where they lingered, where the fog could settle deeper. It felt clean, not like chemical work, like mathematics, precision made manifest. One afternoon, I sat inside a cafe in one of the test zones. The waitress brought tea. Her hands were dry and red, cracked at the knuckles. She apologized, said the weather had been strange lately. Damp. Funny air, she called it. I nodded. I wanted to ask if she'd left her windows open that morning, but I didn't. Instead, I wrote in my pocket journal, fog persists at skin level. Behavioral effects, none reported. The reports went up the chain, successful dispersal, ideal wind speed, no exposure complaints, no alarm, the perfect operation. Still, I began visiting the neighborhoods after the fact, alone, days later. I'd walk the streets, past the same homes, the same schools, and wonder how many particles had entered each body, how many lungs had caught the drift, how many dreams had been shaped ever so slightly by an agent they never saw. They lived their lives unaware, and I stood among them like a ghost in a world I'd altered. I began marking the sidewalks in chalk, quiet symbols only I understood, fog lines, entry points, places where silence settled differently. I told no one. I wasn't testing air anymore, I was measuring obedience. And every time they smiled at me, every time they breathed in without question, I felt it deeper. That awful, godlike sensation of being unseen and completely in control. The powders came later. Zinc, cadmium, sulfide had been ideal for mapping dispersal, but it lacked substance. It didn't move like a pathogen. It didn't linger. It didn't breathe. We needed something organic, something that could mimic infection without causing it, at least not immediately. That's when they brought in the microbes. Bacillus globigi, inert, non-pathogenic, a stand-in for anthrax, they said. It behaved like the real thing under most conditions, but it was safe. Then E. coli, genetically softened, barely viable. It wasn't supposed to reproduce aggressively, just float, drift, land. We called it biological realism. The first time we released it was through the air vents of a railway carriage, an old passenger train passing through London. Hundreds of unsuspecting commuters. We released the aerosol in brief intervals, noting how the bacteria traveled, who it reached, where it settled. Then we placed air filters, particle counters, and hidden collection units throughout the route. The bacteria moved beautifully. It curled through ducts like instinct. It latched onto fibers, clung to warm surfaces. I remember the way it traced the seams of an upholstered seat like ivy. I remember how the passengers never flinched. That was when it started. The sensation. It was barely there at first. A taste, metallic, dry, just as the fog settled and the pump clicked off. The smell of wires warming under pressure. Then a breath, not mine, not loud, just present. I heard it first in the tunnels, under Piccadilly. We'd staged an overnight simulation, pumping bacteria through the ventilation systems at low velocity. I was alone collecting samples, no one else in the corridor, but I heard breathing, close, wet, like someone exhaling into the back of my neck. I turned. Nothing. I laughed. Fatigue, lack of sleep. The human brain invents voices in unfamiliar rhythms, but it didn't stop. Every time I entered a test zone, whether it was a subway, a sealed chamber, or an open street, I'd hear something. A whisper in the fan duct, a gasp behind a closed door, always just after dispersal, always faint, but unmistakable. I didn't report it. Instead, I began testing myself. I started wearing a portable air sampler, checking my own exposure. I took nasal swabs. I even cultured my own skin cells in the lab freezer. I found trace microbes, harmless, but present. I kept going. We ran experiments in the underground, sprayed near air shafts and tunnel bends, released clouds into public toilets, onto escalator grates, into museum HVAC systems. I learned how air moved like memory, coiling, persistent, impossible to remove, once embedded. I knew which corridors echoed too long, which corners seemed to wait. I learned to walk quickly through certain zones, not because I feared detection, but because I hated how the walls seemed to inhale. No one else heard it. At least no one admitted to, but I noticed the others began working with headphones on, claimed it was to mask the fan hum. They didn't stay long after dispersal. No one wanted to be the last man in the tunnel. I started keeping a private log, anomalous perception journal. October 14th, faint whisper behind East Duct, like a breath being held. November 2nd, metallic taste stronger, not from particles, from anticipation. December 9th, felt watched, all instruments off. One sample dish rotated on its own. The whispers got louder in certain areas, old government basements, research tunnels, storage halls, places with no windows, places that had absorbed too many simulations, too many particles. The voice in the air was never distinct, not words, just pressure, rhythm, presence. I began to wonder if it was the bacteria themselves, if enough of them suspended together could act like a single intelligence. That's when I stopped sleeping in my flat. I started staying near the labs, next to the filtered rooms. I felt safer there, where the air was artificially scrubbed, where I could hear nothing but machines. Still, sometimes in the morning, I'd wake and taste metal in my throat, and for a split second, I'd think I heard someone else breathing through me. The selection process was never random. They gave us criteria: population density, architectural layout, prevailing winds, but it was always left to us to choose, quietly, precisely. Entire neighborhoods became laboratories because I circled them on a map. At first, we followed the protocol. A team would scout ahead, pretending to be meter readers or city engineers. They'd take photographs, they'd note street angles, wall heights, open windows, bus stops. Then they'd leave behind a mark barely noticeable. A chalk line on a chimney, a rock set in a precise corner of a garden, a folded paper left in a gutter. That was how we designated dosage zones, and they never noticed, not once. One man painted fence posts with a mix of fluorescent dye and moss killer to tag long-term drift zones. Another dropped hair-thin strands of metallic thread from rooftops to track particulate patterns. But after a while, I started choosing them myself, not for data, for curiosity. I wanted to see how far the fog would go, what it would do to different types of people, how it would move around the old stonework of a chapel or sink beneath the cracked windows of a nursery school. I began walking the neighborhoods with a different set of eyes. I looked for vulnerability, for silence, for obedience. I started favoring cul-de-sacs and council flats. I marked buildings with dirt streaks, small dents in garbage bins, subtle shifts in signage. I told myself it was scientific precision, but deep down it felt like ritual. Each site became a private experiment. I remember a primary school with a cracked playground fence and a field of dandelions that seemed to lean toward the street. I marked the tree outside with a thumbprint of grease. 2 weeks later, we fogged the entire block from a low-altitude vehicle dispersal. The next day I went back. Children were playing in the mist, laughing, breathing it in. I wrote in my notebook, "Unaware participants in a purification trial." That phrase stuck. I began using it in my private logs. Not subjects, not civilians, not controls, unaware participants. I'd dream about them. I'd see entire apartment blocks coughing in unison, windows exhaling thick plumes of smoke, buildings shuddering like lungs gasping under weight. I'd wake in sweat. The sound of distant wheezing still caught in my ears. My entries grew frantic. St. Andrews received full saturation. No alarms triggered. Test Zone 9. Church bells rang under full fog. Echoes carried too far. One house in dosage Sector C had open doors front and back. No filters, no resistance. Perfect conduit. Mark that family as porous. I no longer remembered their names, their faces. Just airflow, exposure curves, how their doors opened, how their curtains fluttered. I started recording audio during missions, not for analysis, just to capture the sound of the fog as it rolled. There was something in that hush, something between the breeze and the breath. I would play the tapes late at night, listening for shifts, listening for answers. One tape caught a woman humming to herself as the fog passed her window. The melody never changed. 3 notes repeated softly. I listened to it for hours. She never stopped humming. Even when the fog slipped beneath the sill, I dreamed she was singing to it, inviting it inside. After that, I marked her house again. We dosed it twice. The records don't show it. I never filed the second pass. But I remember how still that street felt afterward. Not empty, just quiet in a way that didn't belong to humans anymore. I kept marking homes, even when we weren't scheduled to test. It gave me a sense of control, like I was preparing the world for something it hadn't yet earned, something purer, cleaner, They told us we were preventing war, but I began to believe we were doing something else, that the fog wasn't just simulation, that it was selection, and the people below were not innocent. They were just the first ones we let breathe what came next. It had been nearly 9 years since the operation when I returned to one of the early sites, a seaside town we called Sector 2A. On the maps, it still looked the same. Tight rows of homes, a school, a single bus line. But the moment I stepped off the train, something felt wrong. The air wasn't heavy, it wasn't tainted, it was just still, unnaturally so. I walked the old routes, the roads where we released the zinc cadmium clouds, the alleys where we positioned our collection sheets. The painted fences were now chipped, the rooftops we marked with chalk were faded. But I recognized them all, and none of it felt right. The trees, those thin ash and sycamore trees planted every few meters, looked brittle like paper before the match. Their leaves curled at the edges, their bark paled toward a uniform gray. They didn't move in the wind. I waited 5 full minutes to see a single one sway. It never did. Outside the primary school, children played in silence. Not total silence. There were voices, yes, and laughter, but soft, restrained, as if they were mimicking the sounds of play, not experiencing it. Their movements were stiff, eyes distant even as they kicked a ball between them. Something was off in the cadence of it all. I stood there longer than I should have, just watching. That evening, under the cover of fogless skies, I scooped several samples of soil from the base of the schoolyard tree and from the gutter beneath the old council building we had used as a dispersal point. No one saw me. Or if they did, no one asked. I wrapped the soil in plastic, labeled the bags not with real names, but with the phrases I had used in the past. Echo A, zone memory, cadence drift. Back in the lab, quiet, sealed, safe, I ran the tests in secret. Zinc and cadmium levels were elevated, as expected, but there were additional traces, synthetic compounds I didn't recognize. They resembled industrial coatings, maybe residues from our early dispersal canisters, but the configuration was unusual, fragmented, as if the materials had degraded and recombined over time. One sample reacted to UV exposure by pulsing faintly, not glowing, pulsing. That wasn't possible. I logged the data in a private journal, not on any official server. I told no one. I told myself it was contamination, maybe the tools, maybe something in the bag, but something deeper in me knew that wasn't true. It wasn't just in the earth. It was in the people, in the town's stillness, in the way no birds nested above the rooftops, in the absence of moss on the bricks, in the fact that no gardens, none, had any overgrowth. The hedges were cut, yes, but the grass looked painted on. I returned to the lab the following week with fresh recordings from the site. Ambient sounds, wind, footsteps, street noise. I scrubbed the files, listening for anomalies. What I found wasn't noise, it was absence, a frequency void. Certain ranges were gone, frequencies usually filled by insects, air hiss, human murmur. They were just empty, scraped clean. I tried to replicate the environment in chamber simulations. Couldn't. I played the field recording in my flat one night, hoping to test it against my own instinct. Halfway through, I fell asleep. I dreamed of a neighborhood with no shadows, just blank houses and children with no eyes, standing in place, not moving, just listening. When I woke, my mouth was dry and my hands were stained with something that smelled like iron. After that, I stopped recording. I began sealing off my apartment, blackout curtains, draft stoppers, air filters running non-stop. I didn't want to breathe anything that remembered. Because I had started to believe that what we sprayed didn't just settle in soil or windowsills. It nested, it adapted, it remained, not like a pathogen, like a signal. And it didn't forget. Nothing grew there again. and I have not felt clean since. It started with my hands. No matter how many times I washed them, they didn't feel right. The soap left no scent. The water ran warm, but I couldn't register the temperature. I began scrubbing harder, counting strokes up to 30, then 45, then 70 on each side, palms, fingers, wrists. Still, a film remained, invisible, but present. I stopped shaking hands, avoided doorknobs, began carrying gloves. At first, people thought it was post-pandemic protocol, then they stopped asking. The windows in my flat stayed closed, taped, layered with plastic. Air purifiers ran day and night. I bought 3, replaced the filters weekly. I wore a mask to sleep. It didn't matter. Every morning I woke with my throat raw, tongue metallic, lungs sore, as if I'd been breathing something too sharp to name. And then came the coughing, not mine, at least not always. It would come from the walls, from the pipes. Once from the vent above my bed, wet and rhythmic, like lungs pushing through decay. I followed it once, sat in the bathroom with all the lights off, just listening. It stopped when I turned on the tap. I didn't sleep much after that. One morning I found a note on my desk, plain paper, no handwriting I recognized. It read, "Are you breathing it now?" I stared at it for hours, ran fingerprints, checked the lab cameras. Nothing. No one had entered, but the question followed me. I began testing myself in secret. Blood samples, saliva, swabs. I compared my own baseline data to the old exposure logs from the field. Traces of heavy metals, benign levels, but persistent. Certain compounds matched those found in the early dispersal trials, but it was the skin that changed everything. Under UV light, the surface of my forearms began to glow, faintly, inconsistently, like phosphorus hidden beneath scar tissue. I applied different filters, different intensities. The patterns shifted, not random, not uniform, symbols. At first, just lines, arcs, then something closer to letters, but not in any language I knew. They seemed familiar, like something from a dream I'd had long ago before any of this started. I documented them, photographed, compared them to known contaminants, skin conditions, chemical burns. Nothing matched. I didn't file the results. I didn't upload the images. I burned the paper copies and encrypted the digital ones, because I began to believe this was no longer residue. It was instruction, written not on paper, but on flesh. I became convinced I hadn't been observing the experiment. I'd been inside it all along, that the fog, the bacteria, the compounds, they were never just meant for population dispersal. They were meant for proximity, for closeness, for replication. I was exposed every time I opened a canister, every time I tested the dispersal valves, every time I stood downwind, telling myself it was safe. I was told the agent was inert. But what if that was never true? What if inert just meant patient? I checked the early notebooks. My handwriting shifted over the years, became tighter, cleaner, more symmetrical. My phrasing changed. Clinical, yes, but less human. Like I was reporting but not feeling. Even my thoughts started echoing. I'd think something and hear it twice. Once as a thought, once as a whisper behind my eyes. I began leaving voice memos to confirm the boundary, to remember which voice was mine. Sometimes I played them back and couldn't recognize the speaker. Once I said a phrase into the recorder, "I am not contaminated." When I played it back, the audio was clear, but the voice said, "I am not contained." That night, I dreamed I was standing in the center of a fog-covered street. The buildings around me were breathing, slow mechanical pulses like lungs made of concrete. And when I opened my mouth to scream, I exhaled a cloud of silver mist. I woke coughing. I don't go out anymore. The experiments were years ago, the records sealed. But I know it didn't end there. Not for me. I was the one who opened the canisters. I was the one who walked through the clouds. I told myself it was for the greater good, but I see now I was never on the outside of this. I haven't been on the payroll in over a decade. No more official badges, no classified briefings, no grey envelopes with route coordinates. I'm not on any list, at least not any current one. But I still see it, every morning, without fail. The fog. Not the kind weather maps predict, not the condensation that clings to the Thames or crawls up from the moors. No, this fog is thinner. It glides under the skin of things, rises off pavement before your eyes adjust, clings to glass in ways dew never should. I see it between the beams of car headlights, in the fluorescent hum of stairwells, in the way the air pauses before a door opens. I see it in people. On the train platforms, I stand behind the yellow line, far from the ventilation ducts. I watch faces that don't blink, mouths slightly open, as if waiting for a command. They don't speak much, they don't need to. It's all been said before. They're still breathing it in. I avoid sealed places now. Subways, elevators, underground markets, anything that feels like a capsule, anything that feels too quiet. There's always a second silence in those spaces, a silence you don't hear until you leave it behind. I've started timing my heartbeat before and after passing through certain corridors. The rhythm shifts. I hear things in moisture, in bathrooms with hot showers, in basements after rain. The steam carries something that doesn't belong. It isn't the voice I heard in the tunnels, not anymore. This one is softer, almost sympathetic, a low-frequency cooing, like a lullaby being hummed by something with no mouth. I don't try to record it. It never plays back. The fog speaks only in presence. I've come to believe the testing was never just about chemistry, never just about behavior drift or particulate saturation. It was a rehearsal, not of war, of forgetting. We taught an entire country how not to notice, to accept without inquiry, to breathe without question. We wrapped their homes in haze and told them it was just weather, told them not to worry about the vans, told them not to ask why the birds flew differently that month, and they believed us. Not because we lied well, but because they wanted to. There's something seductive about being protected, about trusting the voice that says it's just a study, it's just precaution, it's just air. I read articles now about respiratory illness spikes, about soil mutation near old test zones. I read about birth defects in patterns that match our dispersal grids. No one connects the dots. They blame pesticides, they blame lifestyle, they blame the body for reacting to something they were told never happened. I drive through the countryside sometimes, just to feel the shift. Open fields, rolling hills, and then suddenly stillness. An unnatural hush in the air, the exact pressure of a moment that's already been tampered with. The fog moves there too. It just doesn't need to be seen anymore. It already lives in memory. I don't remember the last time I breathed deeply. Not fully, not without counting seconds. Not without checking the wind, the filters, the residue on my sleeves. I don't remember what fresh air smells like. Some mornings, I wake with the taste of copper in my mouth and no explanation. I check the windows, they're sealed. I check the vents, still filtered. And yet, the fog finds me. Because it was never really in the canisters. It was in the choice. To comply, to execute, to forget. They think the project ended. They think we stopped spraying. But I know better. I know the fog never left. It just learned how to stay. Because the fog was real. It may not show up on satellite maps or in weather records, but it passed through your lungs just the same. Quiet, compliant, approved. You won't find your name in the files. That's how it was designed. To leave no trace, but the one that lingers in instinct, in the way you hesitate before opening a window, in the way your breath catches on cold mornings when the air doesn't move. If you've ever stood still on a windless street and felt watched, not by eyes, but by something older, something waiting, then maybe you were part of it too.